Everyone, let's welcome Jamie Nash to Dragon Talk. Yay!
Yay, Jamie! Woohoo!
It's the biggest ovation I've ever gotten.
Wow. Well, we have a very large studio audience.
Yes.
I don't know if you were aware of that.
Yeah, it's like the Muppets. We all have to do all the voices ourselves in order to make it seem like a much bigger audience.
Yes.
It sounded great.
Well, we're excited to talk to you because you're a longtime D&D player, but you're also a screenwriter, and I've written a book about screenwriting, or TV writing more specifically, and I'm always fascinated by that connection, right? The people who have been playing Dungeons & Dragons for a long time, dungeon mastering for a long time, and then using those skills for other creative mediums, and the episodic nature of TV just seems to fit right into the session by session play of D&D campaigns. So I'll start off with just going like, what was your history with Dungeons & Dragons? How did you start? What was your origin story as a young kid playing D&D?
Yeah. Well, I got into it in the heyday of D&D. It was kind of the early 80s. I think I was in 4th grade when this person showed up with a character sheet. And the funny thing about it is I cleaned out my garage recently and I went through all my old stuff. So I had all my old character sheets and stuff, literally stuff from 4th grade. And I'm older now, so it's the 80s. By the way, I sold a lot of it because I found that it was worth a lot of money, like even in the horrible condition, like my old like Ravenloft module and
no way,
Oh,
really?
no way.
my deities and demigods. I didn't have the cool one with the Elric stuff. And, everybody asks. They're always like, do you have that? I'm like, no, otherwise I'd be selling it for 5 times as much. So I had a ton of stuff. I mean, just in the last month I sold. So I kind of went down memory lane. But I remember I had like one kid had a character sheet and he kind of lied his way through a couple games of D&D because it was at that weird period where it was I don't know, I'm horrible with like the version numbers, but it was the red and the blue book, the basic and the expert. Right. And then we had a monster manual on the side and we had like some, advanced D&D charts and things like that. So we cobbled together a game. And I think the guy kind of made it up as he went along a little bit and to fill in the blanks. And it was, we just would go over, Keep on the Borderlands over and over and over again. We do it like 1,000 times, like every single day.
With different characters or with the same?
No, with the same characters. Like we just
different
keep going
outcomes.
back. Yeah, it really wasn't the same outcome. We'd be like, let's go fight Medusa again or something. It wasn't even much of a story to it. It was just, we were experimenting with this new magical thing that none of us had any idea, what it was. And it was, honestly, we had no idea what it was. It was like this weird magic that this guy was presenting on my back porch for many years. And as that went on, we got better at it. We bought more modules. It was mostly module based. And I gravitated totally toward the DM side. And honestly, and I'm a screenwriter now, it's my full-time gig. I think that was largely the birth of learning how to tell a story. And I definitely gravitated toward that thing where I made the stories have kind of beginning, middle, ends. I wasn't much into modules. Like I did that a little bit, but I quickly graduated from that. And I tried to tell these rich stories with plot twists and all this kind of weird stuff going on. And I have to admit, a lot of times I would cheat the rolls or stuff because we used to roll behind the screen was the way we did it. We kind of made up some of the rules as we went. So nobody really knew. So I could kind of lie and make the outcomes be what I wanted to.
Just like a real screenwriter does.
Just like a real screenwriter.
Just lies for their living.
It was just lies to make the story work, right? So that was my initial thing, and I did that for many years. I mean, from 4th grade, probably through my college years, I did it, and I get into LARP and stuff like that, which kind of scratched an itch. There's a game called DARKON, if you ever hear about it. And that was invented in my neighborhood. And I was like one of the founding members at the time. Wow. I was like 13 years old. So the padded weapon thing was a big thing. But even that, I took more toward live action D&D as opposed to that game was more battle oriented. It was just like, 2 sides fighting each other. But yeah, I was always on the storytelling side. I always wanted to, tell a story. I always wanted to be in charge of that side of it.
I always wonder when we hear people say that they gravitate towards being a dungeon master because they want to be the ones telling the stories. And is it was it that you already had that love of storytelling in you, which made the role of dungeon master appealing? Or was it the loving being a dungeon master that made you want to pursue screenwriting or writing in general?
I think in my case, I already had the storytelling in me. Like I had these stories bottled up, and I had this was pre-internet, pre anything. So when I used to want to write, I had to use a clunky old typewriter, and it was horrible. I could never, but in D&D, I could sit in my back porch and come up with a story that my friends loved. I mean, they'd come back for more and more. They craved more and more. And I could tell those stories that I had no other outlet for until D&D showed up when I was a kid, to kind of perform in front of everybody and share my story as opposed to just have it in my head.
Oh, I love that. That's amazing. Now, is that any of the things that you discovered in your garage? Any of these old adventures that you crafted back in the day?
It's funny. I used to create a lot of games on my own. So that's more what I found. I didn't really find so much like campaigns or anything like that. Now, of course, I found all the old D&D stuff, like our character sheets and stuff like that. And I had a lot of it. I was a big TSR person in general, so we jumped a lot of games as well. We played Top Secret and Gamma World and some of those early TSR games. But no, it was, I don't think I found any modules or anything like that that would really...
Because some of that was just notes. Right? It was probably just like, things written on a scrap paper.
I think a lot of it was in my head. Like I'd scratch some stuff down. Like for me, it was about, if I had a particular NPC or something, I might plot out what their thing was, and I might make a map, but the rest of it was kind of coming out of my head. So there wasn't, but I'm sure there was stuff written down, but that wasn't in my box of treasures.
That's interesting to me, because I think the instinct to become a screenwriter is different than the director or the other filmmaker or TV director out there, right? Because it sounds like if it was only in your head, then you were interpreting something and making it something. But screenwriting is a very specific, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert here on like you have to put the document out there so that someone else other departments can take what you've written and then turn it into a piece of sequential art, right? And that doesn't sound like that you learned that from D&D.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that the things that are especially in the DNA, that the shared DNA, is the screenwriter is kind of the first thing. Like without the screenwriter, there's sort of nothing. You need to have somebody to tell you, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is the plan at some point. But then, as far as like writing it down and handing it off or something like that, and getting notes. I didn't get any notes as the DM. Like that's the thing. Well, I kind of got notes when people got angry or something at some twist.
Right, you get a Cheeto in the face.
Yeah, that's right. Note. That's right. They were the notes I got early on. But yeah, it's it had a lot of similarities. A lot of my intuitions and instincts, I think, came from those games. It really takes talking to people like you to kind of reflect back on that, and say, where did this crazy thing come from? But I spent a lot of time on that back porch. So
I like this. The back porch keeps coming up. Greg, you said that what you're saying about you don't see the parallel, but I 100% see it with, and I'm saying this as someone who's never written a screenplay or an adventure, but in my mind, I think they would be very similar in that you're giving just enough information, like it comes in from outside and it's windy and now the character speaks or something. Like you're like writing an adventure, you're giving the dungeon masters enough information to go out an adventure and tell a story in this world that you're creating.
Yeah.
But still leaving a lot, I don't know how much you actually leave to as the screenwriter, if you're like, absolutely not, say the line this way, but, or you're coming in through the front door, not the back door. But like once the players start playing in it, there is still going to be a little bit of things that change. Oh, wow. Just like how you're saying, like you get notes as a screenwriter from, as the actors or the directors kind of.
I like that parallel.
No, that's beautiful. I'm going to use that from now on, by the way.
Yes, go for it.
Because you're absolutely right. And again, like I said, I'm kind of learning just talking to you, like thinking about my past. So I appreciate that. But you're absolutely right. Is D&D and I never viewed it as a thing where I was in charge. And even though I said I might cheat a role here and there, it's a collaborative, it's a collaboration. And screenwriting, what I love about screenwriting, and I write novels too. Novels are not a collaboration. Novels are me saying, here's the story. Don't change it. Don't think about it. When I write a screenplay, I'm sending it out to directors, producers. We're all getting together. And if you last a long time in the screenwriting game, and if you want to make a living at it, you have to be collaborative. There's no other choice. In some ways, sometimes I'm a kind of short order cook. Sometimes I'm a chef, but sometimes it's more like, give me a hamburger, and I got to give them a hamburger. And that's my job, is to give the hamburger. And then sometimes I'm deciding what everybody's going to eat for dinner. But yeah, you have to collaborate. But I agree, D&D is the exact same thing. So yeah, I love that.
Do you think maybe you're good at that part of your job, the collaboration part, like giving someone a hamburger when you wanted to give them a hot dog because of your experience with D&D?
Yeah. I mean, in all humility, I do think that is one of my skills. Is I enjoy that part. I don't get, like, certain people, especially in creative endeavors, get very frustrated when they get a note or when they get other ideas. They only can see it their way, and they have a hard time adjusting. And while sometimes it can be very difficult and it can be frustrating depending on the note, that's the part of the job I love. I love working with people. I love the social aspect, and it's also the part I love about D&D. It's the social aspect was always the thing, the getting around the table, right. The being with my friends, the reason to be there, this shared creation was always the thing I loved about playing. So I think there's parallels for sure.
So as a dungeon master, back then, but even now, like, do you talk to players and try to get out character details that you might think are evocative to tell the story, similar to the way you would, in writing a screenplay, and making sure that you have these characters that have defined characteristics? Because I know a lot of people, especially in the older times of playing Dungeons and Dragons, it was just like, I'm a human fighter.
Yes.
And that's it. And that's all I care about. And so, like, were you the type of DM where you were like trying to get out details?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So just to give you my kind of recent history, I don't play D&D as much anymore, but I have recently, and that's the part I love best. And the funny thing is, nowadays when I play, sometimes I do play the character side, where I would never do that. I got to a point where I was like, I'm never playing a character. I can only be a DM. I just don't like it. But I play characters now, and I feel like I'm a storyteller as a character, where I didn't get that back when I was a kid. I didn't realize that I was telling the story as a character. And now, with all my screenwriting background and stuff, I approach it that way. I'm like, I'm a hero with flaws, and I have a strange point of view, and I'm going to try to process my emotions through that. I'm going to try to become some flawed thing that is going to act and try to be heroic or villainous or whatever. And I do that now. So what I love is when my DM, and I used to do this as a kid, I'll explain that too, but I love when my DM really asks me, what do you think your character's flaw is? Why are you that way? Because then they can, and this is something I do in screenwriting. Screenwriting has these character arcs, right? So you have a flawed character, and the story is about them changing to a less flawed character. That's usually what a movie is about, a book is about. And I love it when my DM asks me those flaws, because then, just like as a screenwriter, what I do is I create scenes that attack those flaws. I create things that test those flaws. So I think the best way is for that. I think the best way to DM, this is just for me, I mean, I know there's a million ways, is to understand what those flaws are, so you can construct scenarios that really put people in pressure cookers on an emotional level, as well as an action level and a physical level and a thought and a plot level. So that's my long-winded answer.
That's so smart. I'm already thinking, like, you would be such a good guest for how to be a DM. So we're probably going to have you come back. Just telling you that now.
How did you
Yes.
do that as a dungeon master, though? I would love. How did you get that? You said you did it as a kid as well.
So as a kid, I didn't get this for a while. And again, we just played Keep on the Borderlands and kept attacking Medusa 100 times. But I played for years, and it matured as I went. And I think it took playing other games to figure it out. Because D&D was such a system that I didn't see the story in it. Like I couldn't divorce I couldn't figure it out. To me, it was like, play the modules, play the game, it's the modules, But then when I started to play other role-playing games, the one I remember that really kind of changed me a little bit was a game called Villains and Vigilantes back in the day. And the reason I don't even know who made it or anything, a superhero game.
Yeah,
but the reason that one changed my mindset a little bit was that I took back to D&D was because you played yourself. So all my friends, I knew what their flaws and their hangups and their relationships and their problems with their parents. And I DM'd that. I told a story. So I did the Marvel superheroes equivalent of my friends.
Nice.
But it was in this weird fantasy world. And then once we did that, there was no going back, because then when we went back to D&D, I had to create a similar complex story. But the only way I could do that was by going into their characters, their backstories, and things like that. So a lot of it just came down to creating characters together. They would make the choices, and then I would take that and riff on the choices they made. We do backstories. And this goes, I'm not sure that I do it exactly the same way. I have some other ways I'd probably do it now. But back then we did backstories. We had a friend that became like a big time comic book artist, and he would draw all our characters. We'd pick the right miniatures. We do all these things to try to come up with these stories. And then some of it was, I would just always bring back old adventures into the next adventure. I was constantly looking. A thing in screenwriting that we do, in screenwriting, there's this idea that everything's either a setup or a payoff. So I kind of use the same idea when I would DM. Everything that we did in the past was a setup for something I'd pay off later. And even payoffs can be setups for something that happened later. So if you're constantly echoing what's happened in the past, there's a lot of cathartic kind of, to use the word again, payoff to it. There's a lot, but you get something from it. When it echoes, when you bring it back, when that past matters. So I think then I was constantly looking for those kind of things.
What's an example of a good payoff or setup and payoff for a D&D character?
Oh gosh, you're gonna give me a
no, because I'm just trying to. I want to cement that what you're saying to like an example, because I love it, but I'm having trouble trying to think of how I would weave it into like my current game, for example.
Right. So I might have to do it like sideways. I might have to do it sideways. So there's an exercise that I sometimes do when I'm writing a screenplay, and it's writing a bio through, let's say, objects or something like that. Let's say it's you can write a bio and say, what's a character's favorite song, or what's a small trinket from their past that they have in their hand. What's something they hold. So let's say somebody has a little flute, a golden flute or something. And then you ask that character, you say, well, why do you always carry that golden flute? And they say, well, it was my brother's flute, and my brother died. It was a bard and went missing or something on a pirate ship or something. So then in a screenplay, when I do that bio and I say, okay, flute, my next question is always, how does that pay off in Act 2? How does that pay off later in the movie? So I just saw something like Black Widow. I just saw Black Widow, and they have little like touchstones that they might have. Or no, what was the movie? This one comes to mind. The Mitchells. Did you see Mitchells versus the Machines? I'll use that.
Yes, I did. But Black Widow, I think I have one.
Okay.
Because in the openings and spoilers for Black Widow,
that's why I switched. But go for Black Widow.
No worries. It's not really a really that important detail, but there is in the early part when they're kids, they're upside down, and they say you're upside down.
Yes.
or we're both upside down, and then line is paid off
It's
at the
paid
end of
off
Act
later.
3 when they're adults.
Exactly.
And that one hit me in the feels.
Exactly. And those kind of things hit you in the feels. I think there's a moment with fireflies in that movie
Yes,
that they
the
use, and they
fireflies
come
too.
back and they just echo these things. So if you're writing a bio, the person can come back and play, like that golden flute or whatever, the magic flute or whatever thing. Maybe there's an NPC with a similar one later, and there's a story behind it. Maybe that's how it pays off.
Yeah.
Maybe your character needs to play that flute and play the song to enchant someone later on. There's all kinds of ways that you can take the bio and say what's personal to them, and then set up something in there that's, that the flute is their thing. So is there some way that you can come up with a puzzle that if they think of that flute, they'll nail it? It's hard to, because it is interactive and collaborative, sometimes those things are not going to work out in your story. But then sometimes maybe there's a chance to circle around and find another place to pay it off at the same time. But I think if you're aware of setup and payoff, you can constantly be looking for it. But the only way you're going to know it is if you sit down with your players and their characters and they share those kind of important emotional things, their backstories and things like that. So that's where I'm at with setup payoff.
I love it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk about Save the Cat.
Okay.
This is your book,
Yeah.
and then a website that is based on the book, I'm imagining.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, well, I'm curious what Save the Cat references. I have a feeling, but
Okay.
this is your best-selling book, no less.
It's a best-selling book.
I would like to call that out because that's impressive.
Yes. Yeah. So Save the Cat is a book. It's actually a book that was written 15 years ago. So mine's the newest version of it. I didn't write the one 15 years ago. Mine's a bestseller too. Mine's the new bestseller. But that one's been a bestseller for like 15 years. It's been a bestseller forever. And Save the Cat, what it references is a moment in a movie where a character kind of earns your empathy by doing something nice. So let's say they're a super jerk, they're a thief or something like that, but they take the time to save a cat, right? They take a time. So there must be some heart in them. That's the Save the Cat moment.
Okay.
And the Save the Cat moment is only one small part of the book. It's just became the title.
Yeah.
But that's what the Save the Cat moment is.
Would it work also if it's Save the Tabaxi?
Absolutely.
Okay,
It could be
good.
Even more so, I think.
Yeah.
Good.
You can save practically anything.
That'll be for the D&D crowd.
Sometimes you can kill the cat if you want to show the opposite thing. You can certainly kill the cat if you
That's
want to be
when you want a villain,
Yeah.
right? You want to
You want a villain.
That's
see
the
them kicking
quickest
pets
way
is the way to do it.
Villainhood.
Yeah. And there's like the example. I think one of the examples in the book is like Aladdin. Aladdin is this thief, and it's like, should we root for Aladdin? But I think Aladdin steals a piece of bread early on, but then there's this little boy, and he gives the bread to the little boy. So he's got a heart of gold, a thief with a heart of gold. And I just speaking of, not to again riff back on character, but I think if you can find, especially if you have a flaw in your character, if you can think of what the opposite of that flaw is and say that also exists in your hero. Like, so let's say your person is a thief, or let's say they're selfish. You could say, what's the opposite of selfishness? And you could say selflessness. And then you can express, and then the next question is, how does your hero express selflessness? Because then you have this paradox that your hero is both a thief, but deep down, there's something in them that maybe they're a little different. You can do that with any flaw. So they could be, sadistic or something. And you could say, what's the opposite? And then you could ask yourself how to express that. So it's one of those things, again, as I play characters now, these are the thoughts I come up when I do my character creation. I try to make a paradox for my character. So even if they're the most ruthless jerk, there's some deep down paradoxical element within them that only comes out in certain situations. So anyway, that's a riff on Save the Cat. So yeah, go for it, Charlie.
No, I was going back to the book, because I noticed
Yeah.
that the subtitle is writes for TV, the last book on creating binge-worthy content. And I can only imagine that 15 years ago, we didn't have streaming services and we weren't able to binge content.
No, not
I don't know
at
if
all.
we had DVRs. Yeah, we must have had DVRs.
So the original Save the Cat was a screenwriting book, and its big things that it goes over, and we can talk a little bit about these. The big thing it has is the thing called the 15 beats. That's what most people know it as. And they're 15 beats that every good story has. It's like an outline of things that you want to check off as your story goes to give you a cathartic story with a beginning, middle, end, and all the right plot twists. And I actually think it can be hugely helpful to dungeon masters. I think you find it in any good story, whether it be a wrestling match, a WWE wrestling match, or a TV show, or a comic book, but also in a good D&D campaign or just a good D&D session. I think the 15 beats can show up. So that's the major part of it, is the 15 beats.
What can you explain? What is it? I think I know what a beat is, but for listeners,
Yeah.
what are they? 15 different things, or throughout the course of a story, you have to hit 15 beats before it's over?
Yeah, you hit the 15 beats. So it's almost like a schedule that you're keeping. Like this. At this point, this happens. At this point, this happens. At this point, this.
Okay,
happens.
so it's like an adaptation of like Sid Field's like inciting incident and those things, right?
You got it. So Save the Cat was an evolution, and it's really not a revolution, but it's an evolution of Sid Field, Hero's Journey, if you've heard of Hero's Journey, and some of these other things. It really lines up well with the Hero's Journey. So, the 15 beats, it's like it starts with an opening image, and the opening image kind of sets the tone of the before world. There's a closing image at the end that bookends it. You get a setup of your heroes in the ordinary world. You get a catalyst, which is the event that kicks off the story. Something happens to your hero that kicks off the story. In a D&D campaign, that could be the mission, or it could be an attack on the village or something like that. Somebody gets kidnapped. Then you have this debate, which the debate is preparing for the bigger quest or the journey. And that usually happens next. In Hero's Journey, that's the denial of the call. Then you get a spot what's called the break into two, which is when your heroes decide to take on the mission and they go and do the thing. Whatever the mission is, they go to do it. Then you get fun and games, which is the promise of the premise. It's the reason you're there. So you're exploring the Tomb of Horrors or whatever. Everything else is set up, and then you're inside the quest. You're doing the thing. And then the other ones, so I think most of those happen in most D&D sessions. You have a catalyst where somebody shows up, you prepare, and then you go on the thing. You're in the dungeon quest. I think some of the ones that are more helpful, without going through all of them, is I think the midpoint. So the midpoint in a movie, right in the middle of a movie, there's usually some plot twist. It's usually like a false victory. It could be a false defeat, and it either makes things more personal, or a lot of times it's the bad guy notices the good guys. It's like, oh, I see, I got to stop this, so the villain notices. Sometimes it sets off a ticking clock, like, oh, now we only have 1 hour to pull this off, because they're onto us, or it's going to blow up or something like that. So I think considering, I think going over the beats for a DM is really helpful. And you can find these things free on the Save the Cat website. You can find the beats. But I think especially looking at some of them like the midpoint and keeping them in mind. So your quests aren't just linear. You know what I mean? So you're not just hack up this thing, hack up this thing, hack up this thing. But then the midpoint changes things. It raises the stakes and makes things more tense. So I think a midpoint's really key. Or maybe something that not all DMs do, but some do. So
I'm the binging shows on Netflix or whatever. Like it's very similar, I think, to a campaign.
Yes.
So you take an episode, and that's kind of like your game session. So how many of those beats are you expected to hit? Not expect. I mean, I know you didn't write this for Dungeon Masters, but I honestly think maybe you could.
Yeah.
That could be like a little side project.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
So how many beats would you anticipate? Like, should a Dungeon Master hit in a session, or when you're talking about these beats, is it meant to be spread across the entire campaign?
the good answer to that is it depends. Television's really weird. So in a movie, it's really easy. The movie, all 15 beats get hit, done, because it's an end-to-end story. So the weird thing about television, and this applies to D&D too, I think 100%, the two are almost analogous in this regard. TV shows aren't necessarily stories. TV shows are story engines, right? So you might have, just because it's an easy one to pick on, like Law and Order, that's not a story, it's a story engine. So every week there's a story. So every week Law and Order hits those beats. But in a TV show, some weeks it hits all the beats. And some shows, they're spread across the whole thing. So it's really tricky. If you're telling one story, they're really spread across the whole thing. But what you find in most television shows, and to be honest, my book is mostly about writing pilots, because pilots are the thing that new screenwriters need to write. Like no new screenwriter sits down and writes 20 episodes or 22. They just write a pilot. And so my book's very much contained to that. And that's why TV is such a wide landscape, is that they're free to do anything. They could do 5 episodes that tells one story and the next 5 tells another. If they wanted to, they could tell 10 episodes and one episode could be contained. It could be a complete, did you watch like Mythic Quest? Did anybody watch Mythic Quest on Apple? It's a good show. But they did like a self-contained bottle episode all of a sudden. They just did one of those, they drop in the middle of the season. And then the rest of the season kind of has a story that it tells end to end. But they can drop, episodes in any season. Breaking Bad or something like that, it usually tells one story across one season. It feels like a campaign, and then you might get another campaign, and then another campaign.
But like those, they also, I was thinking about that because that's almost like the way people describe arcs in a campaign, right? Where you'll have a beginning and a middle end of an arc, and sometimes the beginning of arc 2 is actually starting midway through arc 1. Right, like some of those inciting incidents might be starting, and I know like True Blood, I think is a good example of that, where in there's some of their seasons, episodes 9 and 10, the last 2 episodes of the season, were closing out one story, but they were doing the work to try to set up the next story at the end, so that you weren't necessarily ending and being like, well, I have no idea what's going to happen next. Where you're like, no, you actually have 3 or 4 of those beats ready to go, and you know what to expect when you show up. So the payoff of the premise might end up being that first episode of season 4, for example.
You're absolutely right. So what does that mean in that big mess? And it's kind of what I write about in the television thing. I say TV's really weird in that way. and TV writers' rooms, they use every trick they can to keep people entertained. So everybody does it a little different. What I would suggest for Dungeon Masters is go check out these 15 beats. And sometimes you might want a session to hit all 15 beats. It wouldn't hurt for a session to hit all 15 beats. You can have stories within your bigger story. You can tell a 10-episode story, but have, a whole episode tell 15 beats. It could be a complete story if you just looked at it and it kind of end that part, but then it has it to be continued and the bigger picture continues week to week. Or if you really want to, you could stretch it out for the longer period of time. Here's the one part I find though. I find, especially if you're doing sessions, it really depends on your players and your style. But I find that if you can find stories within the bigger story, like it's almost like this weird onion kind of thing, or it's DNA actually, where if you look really close, you'll find the 15 beats. If you look really far away, you'll find the 15 beats, and it just depends on how you slice it. But I think if you're aware of those,
there's beats inside the onions.
There's beats inside the onions. Exactly.
An heirloom onion.
And how you slice them, it changes.
This is some weird vegetarian restaurant.
I'm here for it. I like it. Yeah. I had beets for lunch.
Yeah. So I think if you know the 15 beats, they can help you structure, but they can also help you improvise. Like when you get somewhere, like what types of things are supposed to happen here? Like what kinds of things should actually, happen? Should we raise the stakes here? There's another beat later called the all is lost moment, where usually that's where somebody dies or the mission goes to hell before then you break into 3 and you win the day. That's when you kind of have the finale. And all movies have this. You see this in movies. Like that all is lost is often like somebody gets captured or somebody gets killed or the mission looks lost. So I think an awareness of where you think that is will just help you deliver enough of the gear shifts. And that's really what it is, right? It's like turn up the action, turn down the action, turn up the tension, turn down the tension.
That's really smart.
I think that's what the 15 will help you with.
I like that because it does have, you're right. Sometimes you just want a session. If you have a longer session, you might be able to get all 15 of those into a 4 or 5 hour session. But if you have, I usually play in shorter sessions of like 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And so I'm doing the longer 15 beats type thing, but I do sometimes enjoy the sessions where we have that beginning, middle, and end feel and something happening. And I think you're right. A lot of DMs could look at these.
The other thing I'd say the book has, there's this thing called the Save the Cat genres. And the Save the Cat genres are more like story patterns. They're kind of like common stories that have been told. There's 10 of them. And I'll just super quick to give you an example. There's Golden Fleece, which I think most dungeon crawls are. The Golden Fleece is a road trip story. It's a quest. It's trying to grab a treasure. It's a heist movie. It's something like that. That's your Golden Fleece story. And I think, if you mix up the types of stories you tell. So for example, there's the next one is Dude with a Problem. Or dudette with a problem. And dude with a problem or dudette with a problem is kind of your diehards, It's something, some sudden event happens and sweeps your poor heroes into some horrible thing, And I think there's the other ones that they have are like Monster in the House, which is, it's the horror movies. You're trapped in a house. There's monsters trying to get you. Usually it's brought about by some sin that the heroes committed or something like that. So that could be another one. There's Whydunits, which are the mysteries. And then there's some other ones that might not apply. Like, it's funny, I was looking at them, and Out of the Bottle is one, and that's like Bruce Almighty or Freaky Friday or something like that, where it's kind of this lesson. I was thinking, it doesn't really apply to D&D, but I did this weird campaign, or not campaign, but I did this weird episode with my players when I was a kid, where I did a Freaky Friday where I made them all switch character sheets, but play their characters. I had this thing where they all switch bodies and they had to go on a quest to find like the thing that would fix them. But so it was kind of Jumanji before its time, I guess.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, just looking at these genres, if you want to shake up your game a little bit, maybe try to apply a weird genre like the Out of the Bottle, or I don't know, Institutionalized is another one. It's kind of the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest genre, where a group of people are trying to get you to conform or something. Just looking at these different types of stories might be able to, shake up your own game. And anyway, they're all available on savethecat.com. You can check them out.
It's amazingly evocative about what you're just talking about. I'm thinking about my campaign that I'm going to be running later on tonight that Shelley's husband Bart is actually in. And I literally had like 4 different ideas for next sessions on things that I can do just from what you're talking about. I'm like, oh, they could do that. And and I can connect all that. And I would never even think about that until you start applying these like external ways of thinking about story to what's happening in this campaign. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, they're a great brainstorm tool. I mean, that's how I use them to write screenplays. Sometimes I'll have a story world, and I'll be like, I want to write a thing about I don't know, ninjas or something. I don't know why I picked ninjas. I'm an 80s kid. I picked the ninjas.
What about turtles?
Ninja Turtles. and then I can go through it and I could say, what's a Golden Fleece with ninjas? That's pretty obvious. But what's an Out of the Bottle with ninjas? Or I don't
they
know
turn
why
into
I picked
turtles.
ninjas.
I see.
Exactly.
Very loud.
So I see that a lot of your, TV credits are horror themed, as well as behind you, you've got The Exorcist and some other things behind you. So is horror a big part of your milieu?
It is. I'm definitely a horror guy. I grew up in the 80s, so it was Freddy and Jason and all the cool stuff. Michael Myers is my favorite. The Exorcist is my most the movie that scared me the most, I think. Hellraiser. I'm a huge Clive Barker guy. And I actually love, it's funny, all the fantasy stuff I do now, I totally mix horror tropes. I was also a big Conan the Barbarian. Sword and the Sorcerer was a big movie for me as a kid. These kind of weird movies that did use a lot of gore and violence. And they had a lot of tastes of horror. I even think like Peter Jackson was like one of my favorites. And he went on to do Lord of the Rings. And he used a lot of horror tropes in his fantasy. In those movies, they have a lot of touches that he brought from his horror world into those things. But yeah, I'm a horror guy for sure.
Have you? You mentioned having the Ravenloft original module. Have you been getting into any of the Curse of Strahd or Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft that we recently put out about that type of horror play around the table?
I've heard a lot about Curse of Strahd, and I'm really interested, but have not played it. I've heard that one keeps coming up with my friends and stuff when they bring it up. They're like, you have to try this out. So maybe one day, but I'd love to, because I love that. Again, back when I was a kid, we didn't mix the stuff too much. Like Ravenloft was very mind blowing. Like, oh, you can do this. You can have like a Dracula story in D&D. Now that's what I want to do. That's all I want to do is I want to do that kind of stuff. So I love that it's evolved to that, and so many creative minds have brought that kind of stuff into it. But I haven't tried it yet. So I'd love to though.
I want to hear how you would do it. I'll be your player.
Yeah.
If you want to DM that.
Very cool. Very cool.
So have you ever, when you're creating characters for your screenplays or your novels, have you ever thought about statting them out onto a D&D character sheet? And I'm asking this because I think, Greg, somebody we talked to before had done this, or we had talked about them doing it. And I always think of that idea when I'm thinking about fiction writing. It's creating a character that way.
You know what's funny? So I teach screenwriting too. And I try to come up with creative ways to do it. And one of the ways I came up with recently is I have them write their social media profile. And secretly, it was a character sheet. It was 100% a character sheet. It was. I was looking at it. I had their picture in the corner. I had like their attributes and skills. I get more emotional and deeper. Like I don't worry as much about the physical attributes when I write screenplays. Like I don't care about that as much. So a lot of times I do need to like say, and I suggest people do this with their characters. I like create rules for your characters. Like what is your character's rule? Like when they go into a situation, do they have a rule? Like I will never trust anyone, or I will always, attack first and ask questions later, or something like that, and make like rules. So my character sheets almost are sort of those kind of things that help me when I get into scenes, because then when I get to a scene, I'm like, okay, well, what would this character do? Oh, let me check their list of rules, their 5 rules, their personal secret rules that they keep that no one else knows. And
those can get mapped to like, oh, they have a 17 intelligence, so they're going to be trying to be analytical and tactical about what they're trying to do. But you're just thinking about it more in a narrative statement rather than a numerical thing.
Absolutely, because like the games I've played recently, like I roll the attributes and then I come up with these rules based on the attributes. So it's just chicken and egg, right?
Yeah.
And that's why if you had nothing else, I could see rolling up a character and just brainstorming, what is this person I'm staring at? I could totally see it working. It just depends on what you need, where you're coming from. Like if you're coming from nothing, I think that's a great way to approach it.
That's what we have a segment on this podcast called Random Character Generator, where we randomize a character at level 3 and just see all the attributes and all the backgrounds and all the choices that get made by the AI. And we try to come up with a story. Why do they have these things? Why do they know Abyssal when they're a half-elf ranger?
Right.
And all those little details. It's super fun.
I think that's great. I come from the other weird part of me. I did improv and stuff back in the day too. And that's what I feel that is. I feel that's part of that gene as well. It's like roll up a bunch of stats. Okay, let me look at this. I know this character. Here they are. They have this intelligence, and this is why, and this is how it shows itself. And they have this dexterity, which means in this situation they're this way. So, that's, to me, that's one of the great funs of character generation. Is it's not totally just me implying something. Again, I'm being collaborative, but this time I'm being collaborative with chaos, with dice, with randomness, and I'm chaos and me are creating a character together. And I love that. That's so much fun.
Yeah. One of my favorite parts, I think, well, actually, it is my favorite part of creating a character, other than naming them, is the ideals, the traits, the bonds, the flaws. And sometimes I just will use the table and just, you tell me what my flaw is, and then I can create my backstory around it.
That's great.
It's just, I think that's just a fun way to develop this character that you're playing. Like Greg DMs at the end of every one of these episodes. He DMs, he's the dungeon master and I'm the character. And I was just looking at that character sheet. I'm like, I don't even think Greg knows some of these things about me. But I think knowing like what my flaw is, it would make sense, Greg, why Drunky does some of the things that she does.
What is your flaw?
I'm quick to assume that someone is trying to cheat me.
Oh.
Wow, that's great.
She's very impetuous with
that
her
explains
actions.
a lot of your reactions about every single character, trying to be like, I'm rolling an insight on them right away. Also, I've pulled the rug out from under you a few times, so
I know your style.
The distrust is earned.
No, that's great. I mean, that's what screenwriting is too, is you know those flaws, and then you create scenarios around those flaws, and then you let the character tell you what's going to happen through those scenes. So it's so similar. The two are so similar.
If you just take away the word screenwriter from that statement, you're talking about dungeon masters too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why it taught me so much as the kid on the back porch.
That's awesome.
I feel like the back porch needs to show up in a movie or something.
Right? I want to see that back porch.
I can visualize a back porch in my mind. I don't know if it's...
It was legendary. I went to my friend's, one of my players' 50th birthday this year. We're getting old. And and I went there, and all his new D&D buddies were there. And that when I walked in, they were like, "This is the guy, the back porch," and they knew all our stories.
God.
And it was really cool. And they were like, "Oh, you were the one that did the thing," and he had told them the old stories. He was the DM now, which I can only imagine. I'll have to play with him one day. But I walked in and all these new D&D players, because they were all much younger than him too. But that was the table I sat at the party and talked to the whole time, because they were the most fascinating. Yeah, they knew all about the back porch.
That is awesome. I know. Now I want to know. I want a screenplay around that back porch and what happened there.
It was probably Stranger Things.
Yeah.
I kind of picture that, but not in the basement, in the back porch.
Or E.T.
Yeah.
Portable hole.
Yeah. So the binge-worthy content is, if you had to leave Dungeon Masters with, I don't know, your number one tip we want as Dungeon Masters, for our players to binge the content. We want them to look forward to coming back to that next session. We want them to be excited about the story that we're telling. And I'm saying we like I'm a dungeon master. In this conversation, I am.
You will be.
So what's the number one thing that a dungeon master should do in every session to make those players look forward to coming back?
Yeah. And it's the same thing in screenwriting. It's make them feel. So it's an emotional thing. I always say it's punch him in the feels throat. That's what you want to do. So you want to hit them really hard in the feels throat and let them feel something. I think there's an advantage in Dungeons and Dragons to hitting them in the feels. Movies, you're always going to be a surrogate. But the characters really embody their characters, and there's ownership. And there's history, and they have to live with those characters going forward too. Whereas a movie, you just turn it off and you go watch the next movie. I'm over Black Widow already. I'm not going to cry about Black Widow tomorrow. But yeah, it's make them feel. I mean, and I'm sure that's on page 1 of any dungeon master kind of how-to thing, is figure out a way to make them feel. I think there's a big advantage that DMs have with that.
Mm-hmm. And you gave us some good ideas on that, like taking the item that they or something that they're attached to and finding ways to bring that back and with the setup and the payoff and all that. So
I think another way you can do it too, like I always tell my screenwriting students, and this goes back to the flaw thing. If you can figure out what the hero's flaw is and what their backstory is, I always say as a writer, you need to be an angry god, right? You're the angry god. I think as a DM, you're a benevolent god. You're not like punishing them. You're trying to teach them a lesson or send them through the grinder or humble them. But you got to be, if you know their flaws and you know what makes them tick and you know the buttons to push, I think that's a big help as a DM.
Yeah. And you have to be angry as the writer because you want to set them up in circumstances where they're going to come up against things that are going to put the flaws.
In screenwriting, you have to be a little mean. I don't know. I think in DMing by its nature, you're a little mean. And sometimes people can be too mean. But as a screenwriter, because they're characters, you have to be mean to them. Some writers aren't mean enough to their characters. But nobody ever came out of a movie and kind of said, like, I think Aaron Sorkin said this, those obstacles were too hard. They were too hard, So D&D, the obstacles could be too hard. It's a game. So I'm not sure that I'd quite give it the same tinge, but I do think, make it challenging, make them feel it, make them scared, make them sweat. Tension tension is actually the key to binge-worthy and page flipping. It's all about tension. It's always, that's like, as a screenwriter, you're always manipulating tension. And I'm sure in DMing, it's the same thing, manipulating the tension.
I love it. That is so true. Easy. And I think you've given me a lot to think about as a dungeon master, and I think you're going to give our listeners tons to use and reanalyze some of their, tried and true methods and try to evoke some of those feels out there. Mm-hmm. I love it. Thank you so much, Jamie Nash. How can people get in touch with you or find out more about your book and your career? What's the best way?
Yeah, so Twitter's the best way. I'm all over Twitter. So I'm at Jamie_Nash, and I'm JAMIE. You'll find me. That's the easiest way to find me. And go to savethecat.com if you want a lot of free information. You can buy the books too. I hope you do. And my book is Save the Cat Writes for TV is the book I wrote.
Yeah. Sweet. And it sounds like a lot of great resources and ways that people can use the content in that book in their D&D games.
Absolutely.
I'm going to do it right now.
Yeah.
And now the yard people are outside and they're weed whacking right outside my window.
And that's the perfect cue timing to end any D&D session. Thanks, Jamie.
Tension. I'm leaving you with tension.
No. Will the weeds get whacked?
Oh, they will.